Hi everyone, and welcome to another brief session on using Adobe Connect. This time around we're having a look at it from a student perspective. My name's Lachlan, and you may have seen me in some of these other videos, but today we're just going to have a look at what the experience of using Adobe Connect looks like for a student. Some of the features you'll see in all of your lectures or webinars, online classes, and others maybe you haven't seen and might be introduced by lecturers that you have for other subjects. Feel free to ask about them and perhaps even request some if you think they might make your experience more enjoyable. So we're going to have a look around the basic Adobe Connect. That's what this environment is called, Adobe Connect. We're going to have a look at that environment and what it looks like for students. The first thing you should take a note of is we've got these boxes inside the room. These are called pods, and each of them has a heading at the top that gives you a rough idea of what it does. So down here we have a chat pod where people in the group can type things in. Stuff goes in here. So everyone can see that when you're typing in the chat pod. Up in the top right hand corner there's a webcam that's on at the moment. You can see me. So you may see your lecturer using a live video in a webcam, or you may find that they're thinking about bandwidth and everyone's connection, so they might just have a picture of themselves. So I'm actually going to turn mine off so that we save on the bandwidth in this case. And we'll just leave a picture of myself up there. So that's also quite common. Next to that, we've got a notes pod. In this case, as a student, I can't type in here. I can just read what's going on. And that gives us a bit of a rundown on what's happening in this session. So these are the topics we're going to cover briefly over the next few minutes. And usually that's quite helpful for your lecturers as well, because that'll help them have a bit of timing, structure, etc. So using a notes pod is quite popular. So feel free to look through those if you're curious about where we're going over the next 5 minutes. Then we have this big grey area here, which is you can see is a screen or document share. And that's usually where your lecturer will load up slides, documents, websites, their own desktop, for example, whatever it is that you're going to be looking at together as a group whilst they're presenting. So if you were thinking of PowerPoint slides, for example, that's where they would be loaded for you to look at whilst the narrator, or the lecturer in that case, is speaking. Over on the left here, we've got an attendees pod, who's in the room. And at the moment you can see under hosts, so who's in charge of the room, we've got myself, which I guess you could say I'm the lecturer in this situation. And then under participants, we've got the student version of me. So I've logged in as a student as well, so that we can see what the student view looks like. And most of the time this will be filled with your classmates, your peers, and at least one of the academics from the subject in here. Just at the top of the screen, you'll see that there aren't that many options for you to worry about. Obviously, you've got an icon here that has a picture of a speaker, and you can see that at the moment they're all white. If it's white, they're not being used. So you probably want to make sure that they've been clicked and that they're green so that you can hear things. And if you've got multiple speakers, or you might be using a headset, for example, you can adjust those things in here. And then next to that is a little status button. We'll come to status button in a moment, but keep in mind that the majority of the time in online meeting sessions, it will probably be the academic speaking mostly, with students using other tools in the room to communicate. Only one person can talk at a time, so it's sort of, there are definitely some rules about turn taking. Whose turn is it to speak? Otherwise it would be a mess. So basically there will be opportunities when your academics want students to participate, and they'll say, right, if you've got a comment to add, you can raise your hand and I'll turn your microphone on. And at that point we come back to our little icon up the top here. The first one there is about raising your hand. It says set status. If you hit the drop down next to it, there are actually a few options available. You can raise your hand, which we just talked about. If I did that, then the academic knows that I've raised their hand, and they can turn on my microphone and I can start talking. Some of the other options might be to agree with what they're saying or disagree, if they're not speaking loud enough or they need to speak softer. Keep in mind you can adjust your own volume. You've got full control over that. and a couple of others there as well, and you can always remove whatever your status is. This is a quick way to let the academic know what's going on whilst they're presenting their content. So most of the time you're going to see these standard pods in a room. There'll be a chat pod for you to put your own comments in. There'll be some content loaded in here, so let's load some up now. Let's say, for example, that we have a very important PowerPoint that's being shared in the room, and the academic would be moving through those slides and talking about things as they're going, and you would be listening. So it's a fairly passive exercise, right? However, there may also be times where they then turn on the ability for people to draw and mark up what's going on in that room. And in that case, you can see this draw bar's appeared, and they might ask you to identify some things. At that point, you can start using the marker or some of the other tools and start annotating yourself, or they might be drawing themselves, and moving through the slides, allowing you to participate or engage in that as well. Sorry, don't hurt the bunny. That's all right. This is an example of how the tool works. You can mark up or annotate anything that is shared inside the SharePod. So that's a PowerPoint, but you'll notice there's nowhere here for me to download this. So we'll get to that later, but more often than not, students want to be able to download the same files that they're looking at, not just view them. So we've shown that there are ways for you to annotate them, to mark them up, but we'll get to how to download those as well. So that's a PowerPoint. There may also be PDF files, etc. And occasionally what you might find is that the academic has in fact turned off the syncing, which makes you progress through the slides as they do, and turn on this little progression bar that allows you to determine which slides you want to move through at what pace. So look out for that as well. If there are controls underneath the slides, that means they've turned on self-progression, which means you can move through the slides yourself, but more often than not, it will be this view where you can actually view the slides, and as the teacher moves through them, so do you. Okay, so that's using the SharePod. Now, the other thing the SharePod can do, apart from documents that are being put in there for students to view at the same time, is to, they may want to share something on their own desktop. So as an example, I could do the same thing and say, right, well, actually at the moment, I've got our subject site, for example, that I want to share with the students. So I would be using a SharePod to do that. Now for students, you'd be able to see this, but the academic at the same time can't really see what's going on in the room. They're talking about something on their screen and scrolling through that, so you can see it at the same time. But if you do put any comments in your chat pod, for example, they can still see them in here. And if you've got other comments to make, or you want to have input into that whilst they're sharing their screen, you can certainly still do that in your meeting room. So let's go back into our meeting room. We've had a look at screen sharing and document sharing. Now we're going to have a look at some of the other functions that we have in here. We also looked at drawing. Where you've got files that you want to access, you may find that the room has a file share pod available. So that means that the academic has loaded up files for you to download into the file share pod. And so that means that you would then select those in the room, and then you can click on download file and download those locally. Always a good idea to ask if there are files that you want from the session. Are we going to get tonight's slides, etc.? Just ask, and they will load them into a file share pod for you. If they're not sure how to do it, we can certainly help them with that as well. So that's a file share, pretty quick. We also have another tool called the link share. So link share works the same way. If there are URLs that you've been using, then you would be able to click on those in here and then click on browse to. It will open those web links up in your browser. So I've had a look at some of the basic functions in the room. We'll stop there for a moment and then continue the presentation.